family. It's April 20th, 2018. I'm sitting in the living room of Arit Guttmacher's home. And Arit is the commander of this production. She's the director, she's the sound man, she's the photographer. She has volunteered to make a tape of my mother's history as I remember it. My mother was Pauline Greenberg Auerbach, and her parents were Sarah Auerbach and Israel Auerbach. They lived in Russia. They were born in Russia. Her parents were Russian citizens, and their home, as I understand it, was someplace south of Kiev in Russia. At some point in their life, they decided they would leave Russia and move to the United States. When they left Russia, I surmised they had some wealth, because I have pieces of china and linens that came from their home in Russia. So they did not come to this country as paupers. They brought 2 sons with them. The oldest son was Abe, and the second son was Nate. I think Nate was 9 years older than Mother, and Abe was a little older than Nate. I've seen a picture of these 2 boys. Possibly they were 7 and 9, very, very well dressed, very, very well groomed, and standing there like 2 very nice sons. Israel and Sarah Auerbach settled on the Lower East Side of New York City, and Mother was born on Cherry Street. It was a tenement area for immigrants, and she was born in 1896. Israel Auerbach apparently was a very good businessman, because Mother told me that her father had 9 tea and coffee shops in New York City with his uncle. And I surmise the family was doing exceedingly well. But at that time in the history, there were Jewish organizations like Hayas and other organizations that didn't want the Jews congregating in cosmopolitan centers. There was always some anti-Semitism, and these organizations thought that if the Jews fanned out over the continent of US, there would be less opportunity to anti-Semitism. So there were a lot of circulars advertising this free homestead land in the West. And Israel Auerbach decided he wanted to be a farmer, that this was what he really desired, because in Russia they were so limited, the Jews, that they couldn't own land. And just the thought the dream of having this expanse of your own land and your own home was very strong. So he made arrangements to move the family from Cherry Street to out to homestead land, which was at that time in the center and western part of North Dakota. Again, I surmised when they moved, they had wealth, because they were able to supply a boxcar with possessions, and they moved out to the homestead. A lot of what I'm going to tell you about homestead life and early life in the neighboring town of Ashley, I learned from a tape that Jeffrey, our son, and I listened to as we traveled to the rededication of the Jewish Homesteaders Cemetery outside Ashley, where we took part in this dedication in May of last year. I want to get back to the homestead now. Israel had a home built. At this time, Mother was 8. She didn't remember too much about this home, except that it had some pink paper on the wall. She once told me at the age of 8, she was sent out on the prairie to guard the cows, and that she was deathly frightened being a city girl. Israel Auerbach bought 17 horses and 38 cows to begin his farming industry. The two boys were now older. I don't know if they were in high school or not, but instead of keeping them on the farm to help, the boys were boarded and roomed in Aberdeen, South Dakota, where there was schooling for the boys. So if you can picture this small family trying to make a go on this homestead, and during one period, Israel Auerbach was able to bring his wife's two sisters and family from Russia to this Ashley, North Dakota area. Whether these families lived on the homestead, whether they helped on the homestead, I don't know the timing of this. But after 3 years, Israel Auerbach decided he couldn't make it on the homestead. One of the problems, additional problems, were the soil was so poor. In this area of North Dakota, there were great big rocks. You had to clear the land of rocks, and that was just a horrible experience. And these homesteaders, or the farmers in general, were short of manpower. They didn't have enough help to develop the land. Well, according to Mother's story, after 3 years, Israel wrote to his uncles. He had the uncles involved in the tea and coffee business with the 9 stores for some coffee. And one of the uncles sent 100 pounds of coffee out to Israel Auerbach. And from this 100 pounds of coffee, he went into Ashley and he developed a general store. And at that time, you could open a general store on even $500 credits. But I saw this store. It was a white store. It was on a corner. It had steps leading up to it. There were benches outside because the farmers would come in on Saturday, and it was a big occasion. Mother would say they would order a can of sardine, buy a can of sardines and a box of crackers and sit on these benches and have a marvelous supper as they spent part of the day in Ashley buying supplies. The story was that Israel was very generous with credit. When a farmer would come and he couldn't pay for his groceries, he would carry the farmer for a year until the harvest came, and then he would collect his money. Another story about Israel that I heard quite early is that he had a Russian seminar. This is a Russian copper container with a flame under it to make tea, and the story is he drank 56 cups of tea every day. As Mother matured, she began working in the store, and she became a bookkeeper. And she wasn't called Paulina, as I understand, but the customers who were Germans, and oftentimes anti-Semitic, would call her Paulina. I heard one story that Israel went into bankruptcy 3 times, but he always paid these debts back. Another part of this story is that there was a villain character in Ashley. I won't mention his name, and he would foreclose on the Jewish homesteaders. He wasn't liked, and to pay off some of Israel Auerbach's debt, Mother went to his office and described herself as sitting on a high stool in front of a high desk with this big book open, and she was doing book work for Louis Rubin. At times, this family, I would guess, had wealth. I saw the home they lived in at one time, a big white house, a wraparound porch, a barn, and when Mother graduated high school, her family was able to order her dress from the fancy department store in Minneapolis. Right now I've lost the name of this department store. It may come to me later on. During her high school years, as I talked about Ben Greenberg's education, Ben came to Ashley, and according to one of my auntie's sisters who lived in Ashley, because there was a Rabbi Hess, one of his daughters, Helen, married mother's brother, Nate, and settled in Ashley, and a sister of Helen, Hess, Arbach, told me with our mother and dad, it was love at first sight. After high school, a person could teach country school. And Mother related that she decided she would be a teacher of country school, and somebody drove her with a wagon out to her first place that she would board and room, because that was the custom, that the teacher would be passed around from the parent to the parents of the students for X amount of time, and she would live and eat with that family. Mother told the story that when she was delivered to this farmhouse and she saw the evening meal on the table, she took one look at her dwellings and said, "This isn't for me," and she requested the family member to drive her back to Ashley. At this period, she also enrolled in a normal school at Ellendale. I imagine this was a college for education, educating teachers, but she didn't like that, and she left. I was never told how long she stayed there, and she went back to Ashley. Ashley at this time had a Jewish community, and Mother felt very comfortable there. Did I say she was fluent in German? And she began working in the store. Both her parents died when they were 53. So she was a young woman, and once I figured out she was maybe 20, but I'm not sure about this. And once I asked her, what was the most important happening in your life? She was older then. She was maybe 65. And she said, the most important event in my life was the death of my mother. The story with her mother was, the mother was working in the garden, and she fell over, and she began hemorrhaging. There was a doctor in Ashley, but these doctors at this time, and particularly in these small communities, did not have the greatest ability. And the doctor treated her without any success and decided she should be taken to the nearest hospital, which was in Bismarck, North Dakota. The family put her on a door. The door was supported by 2 sawhorses. A boxcar was rented, and her daughter-in-law, Helen Hess Arbach, was to accompany her on this trip into the hospital. But on the way, she died, age 53, and buried in this Ashley Cemetery. The story is that 6 months later, her husband, Israel Arbach, had some business in Bismarck. He went into town, he had a meal, and took sick, and it was surmised that he had food poisoning. And he was also buried in this Ashley Cemetery. At that time, the practice was that there would be a grave on one side, then there would be a stone at the foot of the grave, and then on the other side of the grave would be on the other side of the tombstone would be the second grave. And that was how Mother's parents were buried. Mother was very devoted to this cemetery, and I hope to tell you more about that later. In my previous story, and Mother inherited the store. The store was left to the two boys, Nate and Abe, and to her. And because she was a single woman, the two brothers decided they would relinquish their share of the store to Mother. And she related that she became manager of the store with the help of her two brothers. Ben and Mother's relationship grew and grew, and they were married in 1919 in Ashley. September 9th, as I remember, and I read an article from the Ashley Weekly paper describing this wedding. And Mother's dress, again, came from Dayton's department store, and it was a beautiful dress, white with pearls. The wedding was held in her brother and sister-in-law's home, Nate and Helen Hess. It was a very flowery article, as articles were at that time. And I noticed in this article that none of Dad's family attended. I don't know the reason at all. Maybe the workload on their farm was too great, maybe the expense was too great, maybe, who knows? I'm speculating, and I shouldn't. So now we have Mother and Dad married, 1919, and I have here a discrepancy in dates because they were married during Dad's last year at law school at the University of North Dakota at Grand Forks. They had been able to rent something. I never heard much about it, and Dad graduated at the head of his class. There were 9 students in the law school at that time, and he graduated in 1921. And in 1921, Mother and Dad decided they would move to Grafton, North Dakota, because Dad was offered a business opportunity there. Money was always tight in that period of the country's history, so they decided they would move to Grafton. Mother once told me that here she remembered being big with burden. She was carrying Lionel, pregnant, and she would go from house to house in Grafton asking if they had rooms to rent. And there was always some underlying anti-Semitism in Grafton. The Lutherans were very strong, the Catholics were very strong, and it was a period in history where the churches knew that Christ's death was caused by the Jews. Well, they were able to find a home. Grafton was divided by the east side and the west side. The west side was considered better. They found a home on the east side. It faced the railroad tracks. I saw a picture once of Mother holding Lionel, who was born in June 1921, on kind of a wooden, no, it wasn't actually a porch, kind of I'll say a wooden terrace holding Lionel, all wrapped up in some white bunting, and I suppose Mother and Dad were very, very proud parents. Dad's business opportunities in Grafton grew. The judge who had hired him didn't need him anymore. He went into several partnerships. And in 1925, they were able to move into a home on the west side of Grafton, on Griggs Avenue. 1925, I was born in May 1st, 1925. 1925, the family got a new car. It was a blue Chevrolet. The home that they bought was not a new home. They weren't new homes at that period in history. It was an older home, and they had been told that there was 2 old homes put together, because to get into a bedroom area, you had to step up 1 step. Mother was very good at upgrading our home. Our kitchen was very old-fashioned, with a pump that you could get cistern water from, a big sink, a big drain board, really no cupboards. There was a few cupboards in the corner of the kitchen. The linoleum was worn gray and blue. There was a pantry. And Mother decided to upgrade the kitchen. And she did a beautiful job. We had wonderful cupboards, very good working areas. They were the first ones to get an electric stove. When the electric stove was delivered, all the neighbors came to see what it looked like. I don't see how Mother managed with a small oven on that stove, but that was how the stoves were. We were the first ones to get a refrigerator. It was a GE with a coil on top. Again, the neighbors came to see it delivered. She decided the covering, the wallpaper in the adjoining dining room and living room should be replaced, and I remember this, she helping to tear this old wallpaper off the walls, and she helped put up a sheet board first, and then the new wallpaper. She was involved in that. And she updated this house greatly. One feature about Mother in Grafton was she was a great organizer. I feel if we'd had a Jewish community, we were the only Jews there. When they first moved in, there was another family who had some kind of a department store called the Bears. And the young couple was friendly with them, but they left. But we were really the only Jewish family there. And I feel if we'd had a synagogue, she could put her energies into the synagogue. But being we didn't have a synagogue, she was very, very good at organizing. She became president of the American Legion Auxiliary in its heyday. She became worthy matron of the Eastern Star. Pardon me, I have to have a drink of water now. I remember I was home and a group of ladies called on her and said, Mrs. Greenberg, we think that we should have a mother's club to support the school, and we would like you to write the bylaws and to be our first president. And Mother undertook this task and wrote the bylaws and became the president, and she decided instead of each of the 6 grades having their own picnic in our park, they should all have a picnic together. She asked the teachers for a list of the students in some way to rate the income of the families, because she was going to distribute who should bring what, and she didn't want these lower income families to be taxed like the higher income families. And I remember this very, very successful family picnic. Another project I can remember, she was on the board for the Girl Scouts. I was a Girl Scout, my friends were Girl Scouts, and she decided we should have a week's camp at a lake in Minnesota called Lake Plantagenet. She found a cook, Mrs. O'Connell, whose daughter was in our troop, convinced Mrs. O'Connell she would have a vacation at Lake Plantagenet. Mother sat with her and made out the menus. Mother did the shopping. Mother found a vehicle. It was an open truck. Well, the truck had open sides to transport us to Lake Plantagenet with the supplies. We Girl Scouts loaded into the back of the truck. Mrs. O'Connell sat with the driver. We started out in high spirits, but since this was a long trip, by the time we arrived, we were windblown, sunburned, and utterly exhausted. So I'm giving you a picture that Mother was very active. She was very much respected. but she always felt she didn't have any good friends. She felt if she had a good friend and she told something personal to on Monday, Friday this woman would not be her good friend and would exaggerate the personal story, and the whole town would know about it. Mother did not share much with me. And life continued until the beginning of the war in 1941. Then their life changed. I was in high school. Lionel, 4 years older than I, enlisted in the Army, and he was very bright. He had 2 years at the U, Minnesota, which was quite unusual for a small town boy. He was majoring in business and law, and he became a navigator on a B-24. On the second mission, this B-24 collided with another plane. There were 10 in the crew. Of the 10, only 2 survived. Lionel was captured by some German farmers when his parachute hit the ground. He was turned into the authorities, but when his plane went down, the War Department contacted the parents that Lionel was missing in action. And both parents went into this terrible funk. And it took a while, maybe 10 days, maybe 2 weeks, and the War Department then sent another telegram that Lionel was accounted for, that he was a prisoner of war in a German concentration camp, and he was in the section that was reserved for officers, which was far superior to the section for the common soldier. But being he was Jewish, the family was very stressed of how the German captives would treat him. Dad developed this heart condition, which I talked about earlier, and Mother started going into a period of depression. She wasn't able to carry on the tasks, the housekeeping tasks. She said when she was in the garden and she picked beans, her head hurt her terribly. She wasn't feeling as vigorous as she had. I would say this began in 1945, the middle of 1945, towards the end of 45. At the end of the war, Lionel came back home. He was very changed from his war experience. He never, in my opinion, never really regained his health. The family had been counseled that the climate in North Dakota was too severe for my dad. He never really recovered from his heart attacks, and they suggested that he move to a warmer climate. Dad's 2 whole sisters, Jenny Greenberg-Waxman and Lily Greenberg-Dennis, and their families had settled in Los Angeles. Mother's 2 brothers, Nate and his wife Helen, settled in Edwardsville, Illinois, and the older brother, Abe, and his family, wife and 6 children, had settled in the LA area. The parents decided they should give up their home in Grafton. I figured they had lived there 25 years and move out to LA. Dad was able to sell his law practice. The home went up for sale. Mother was in no condition to show the home. I was the one that showed the home. Mother was in no condition to go through their possessions and decide what to leave, what to take. One very sad scene was when she had 2 trunks in the basement. These trunks had come from Russia, and she decided the time had come to empty one of these trunks. And she couldn't do anything alone. She needed me by her side. And we went down into the basement and we opened one of these trunks. She had been airing it periodically. I had been part of this, but never really any history. There were feather beds from Ashley. And in this trunk was a bathrobe that her mother had dyed from. It was brown, it was flannel, it had a figured pattern. It had been slid up the back by the undertaker. She had a bag of false teeth, maybe her dad's, maybe her mother's, I don't know. I don't know what other items she had from the past. And she decided now was the time to burn them. So they were carried out to our alley and we burnt them. As I said, she wasn't functioning well. It was very, very hard, but the decision had been made at the end of 1946. Lionel had already, in the fall of 1946, Lionel had already left to continue his education at the U, Minnesota. 1945, he and Myra Silberg were married. The parents were in no condition to attend the wedding. It was a very small, simple wedding. I had the option of going in, but as I recall, an all-day train ride going and coming. There was nobody I could really stay with. It just seemed like a difficult trip, and I decided I wouldn't really make this effort, and I was needed at Grafton. So at the end of 1946, I was on the train going out to the U, Minnesota, and the parents with Charles were going out to LA. They had a house waiting for them, a house that was owned by Jenny and Morris Waxman. The family out there was eager to greet them and eager to help them. Towards the end of the year in December, I got a letter. I was in school at the U. I got a letter from an auntie, Auntie Jenny Waxman Greenberg, who I knew and who I liked. And she herself was an invalid because she, at the same time that my dad had suffered strep throat, she had too, and had left her an invalid, which really wasn't discovered. She had worked hard on the homestead until she became pregnant with Charles. And then the doctors in Bismarck said, you must spend the time in bed, and after this you must have a nap every day, you cannot exert yourself. And she tried to follow the doctor's advice. I got a letter from her, and she said, your parents aren't doing well, they're living with us, it's a difficult situation, and I suggest that you fly out, that you leave school, that they move into this house, little house, and you get them on their feet. And then for the second semester, which began in January, then you would return to the U, Minnesota. I flew out, we moved into this little home. Mother's condition was not good at all, very depressed, very hard for her to get a meal on the table. The laundry was too hard, everything was too hard. Charles did manage to have a bar mitzvah. She prepared, and I prepared a very simple meal to be served afterwards. She invited the aunts and uncles, her nieces and nephews. The meal was served in the synagogue. I baked brownies, I don't remember. Anyway, Charles had this desired bar mitzvah. He did well. Let's see, when it came to their 45th wedding anniversary, Sid urged I and we 3 kids to go out. Maybe Marcia remembers a trip a little. We went on the train. Again, Mother was able to put together a meal. She had the same family members. It was served in the backyard. Mother said she wanted to celebrate the 45th wedding anniversary because she knew that Dad would not survive to their 50th. During this period, the family made contact with a very good brain surgeon. And Mother became one of his patients. And the brain surgeon determined that Mother had a brain tumor. He didn't know in what part of the brain. That wasn't anything that the medical science could determine. And he said that he wouldn't attempt surgery until Mother had reached a point where she just couldn't survive. Because with brain surgery at that period, oftentimes the patient didn't survive. So Mother's brain surgery was delayed. She was always rapidly going downhill a little. It became apparent that I would not return to school in January. There was kind of a very loose thought that when things settled down, I would enroll in a school out in the LA area. And in the spring of 1946, the parents and I attended a Brit party for one of Mother's nephews, and at this party I met Charlotte Cammons, who was married to a Norman Cammons, who was a family that the Greenberg family had homesteaded near. And when Charlotte met me, she said, "My brother Sidney is coming out for a vacation. I don't know if he knows any young women out here. I don't know his status. But if he would desire a date, would you be available for a blind date?" Well, I jumped at the chance. I, in many respects, was like a fish out of water. I hadn't had many dates in my life. The war had dissipated the young men, and when the young men in 1945 were released from the service and began filtering back to the campuses, I was leaving. So the thought of a date with a nice young man was very appealing to me. A little bit of my story. Norman had introduced me to one of his cousins. The cousin seemed smitten. I was far from smitten. I had been going with a young man at the U of North Dakota who was in dentistry, a very nice, energetic, working his way through college, young man who saw marriage plans for us. I was not that taken with him, and when I left the U of Minnesota, he wanted to transfer out to a school in the LA area, and I told him absolutely not. I said if we were going to have a future together, he would need his education, and to transfer, to leave a place where he was doing well to an unknown school would be a big mistake. His family was very happy for this advice, and as I stayed on in LA, it became very apparent to me that I had no future with this young man. His first name was Norman. I think his last name was Katz. I'm not sure of this either. Well, to continue the story, Sid came out to LA, we met. My family, Mother and Dad and Charles, liked him a great deal. He fit in. The relatives in North Dakota knew Sid because he had driven a truck for the family business, and he had gone to these little towns collecting dead animals for a rendering plant that Sam owned. And Sid said when he'd go to these small towns, there was always a Jewish merchant. He'd look up the Jewish merchant, and oftentimes he would be invited into their homes for a meal. So my uncles knew Sid, and to inject a little of my story, My first blind date with Sid, I went and walked and met one of my uncles, Morris Waxman, and he said to me, "Saralee, I heard you went on a blind date. What brother did you date? Did you date the great big one, or did you date the small one?" And I said, "I dated Sidney. He's the small one." And my uncle shook his finger at me and he said, "Saralee, that's the man you should marry." Well, Sid, I don't remember how much time Sid spent in LA, but our relationship developed in a big hurry. And we became so-called secretly engaged. And at that time, it was determined that Sid and I would marry in LA, and we would settle in Los Angeles. Sid wanted to leave the family business. Los Angeles had a lot of opportunity. His older brother, 2 years, Harold, had decided he would leave the family business, come out, and the two men would get involved in a business. And they did get involved in a business, but in the transaction, the two brothers saw the company, it was a camera shop, was not represented as stated. They backed out of the deal, and Sid decided that Los Angeles wasn't a secure place for him. And in the meantime, we got married in October 1947. We were married, and this was the period that Sid, after our marriage, we had a very small wedding. My mother was still functioning a little. We had 49 people. And after the wedding, apartments were very difficult to get, but we were able, through Norman Camden's father, we were able to get a very barn-like place. After our wedding in October, Sid and I went on a week's honeymoon to Mexico. We came back, and I called my parents. We were back, and how were things? Things were terrible. So we packed up, Sid and I, and we moved in with them. By the end of the year, Sid had decided LA was not a business opportunity for him. And on January 1st, he took the train and he returned to Bismarck, and I stayed on with the folks for six weeks. Before Sid left, Mother underwent brain surgery, and the surgery was very successful. At that time, the doctor didn't know the location. The idea was to cut open the skull, to send in pressured air, to take an x-ray, to determine where the tumor was, to operate, to put the skull back together again. And the tumor was benign. After a hospital stay, Mother came home, and she got milk leg, which was a clot in the leg from inactivity. And the diagnosis was to stay in bed while this clot dissolved. Sid and I, when we decided to make the move to Bismarck, we were quite concerned about my parents, what would happen to them. Charles was in high school. And it was determined that when we got settled in Bismarck, maybe we would have an apartment for them in our home. Mother slowly recovered. I left for Bismarck the middle of March. As I was thinking about Mother, her first visit to Bismarck was when Sid and I was pregnant with Marcia. The summer I was pregnant with Marcia. We were living in a one-room apartment with a Murphy bed. We were over a bar. They were laying new water mains on both sides of this drugstore we were over. To me, it was a miserable environment. Mother came, no place for her. Esther Sloven took her, and she slept at Esther's house. I don't remember that we took Mother on any adventures. I just remember her being in Sid's uncle's store, Gordon Saverin's store, the People's Department store, looking for bargain jeans for Charles. And from Bismarck, she went on into St. Paul to be with Lionel and Myra for a while. Marcia was born in December of 1948. Right before Marcia's birth, the apartment under Sam and Esther Sloven became available, and we moved into this one-bedroom apartment, a big improvement. Ruthie was born 10.5 months after Marcia was born, and when when Ruthie was a year, I had a natural abortion, it was called. We got involved building our home. In June of 1950, around early part of 1950, our home was ready. We moved in. Oh, I was just so delighted with our new home. I had helped design it. Charles had spent 2 summers with us previously because Sid thought Charles living with the parents, it wasn't fair to him that he should come and be with us. It was a better environment. There was a cousin, Bill Saverin, Charles could bum with. We told him to come with his bicycle. Well, Charles was 16. The family had a 1941 Mercury, and Charles drove Mother and Dad out to visit us. They came in June. I remember them coming into our sparsely furnished home. We didn't have money at that time. And she said, "Saralee, I want to talk to you." And we moved over to the couch. It was a sectional, facing each other. And she said, "Saralee, I've never had a holiday. I've never had a vacation." She said, "The only trips I had was to go to Bowdoin to visit Dad's family." Bowdoin didn't have running water. It didn't have indoor toilets. Sid's sisters, I thought, were just very, very nice to her. And she said, "Because I haven't had any vacations, now that I'm with you, I'm going to do exactly what I want to do, when I want to do it, and nobody will tell me what or how to do a thing. I'm going to do exactly as I want." The parents had many visits with us, and I may go into those, but this was her attitude throughout all the visits. The 2 girls were moved to a cot down the basement. I made Mother and Dad very comfortable. They had a nice big room to themselves, twin beds. Mother was very relieved that I was a good cook. I could take care of Dad's very strict no cholesterol meals. The meals were on time. The house was well run. The laundry was done. Mother, I'll use the word, didn't cotton to the children. She only liked her grandchildren. She only liked one of the children. That child knew it, and the other children also knew that Mother wasn't interested in them. Mother's main activity was to go shopping. We had a very, director, should I hurry up a little? I can't see.
No,
okay. Okay. I just spoke to Ruthie. Mother's main activity through that summer was I had sent her a cotton nightie for Mother's Day, and it was just perfect. And the next Mother's Day, I had sent her what I thought was a similar nightie, but it didn't have sleeves, and it should have sleeves. It didn't have the right neckline. It should have a different neckline. And she was in the habit of taking this nightie back to our department store, Lucas's, to exchange it. Well, the first time she did it, she was told this had been sold out and they had another model now. Well, she didn't like the other model, but this kind of, to me, it looked like it was kind of a repetitive action. There was bus service. She said when she came to me, she was going to lose weight. I made healthy meals. I later found out that she said let slip that one of the attractions down at Lucas's was the lunchroom, that they had wonderful strawberry shortcake, and this was a great treat to her. The family was very nice to her. Granny and Sloven and Sam were very nice to my parents. Charlotte and Norman were very nice. Sybil and Saul were very nice. It was a very comfortable environment for them. They particularly liked the holidays with us. They liked the synagogue. They liked the services with Saul Wesselman. They liked the big family dinner for Rosh Hashanah I created. And at one time, Mother and Dad thought it would be better for them to live in Bismarck. And they did some investigating, and Dad wrote a very heart-wrenching letter that he had seriously thought of moving, but the cost of a home was prohibitive. Although it would be a small home, the cost of food was more. There would be heat to pay for, and it was impossible for them to move. I cannot say how many visits they had with us. After Charles got married, they would no longer, Dad could not drive that far, and they would come on the train. And they would have these very, very long, extended visits, always very much the same pattern. Dad built a sukkah. Dad seemed to be able to find things to occupy himself. He took a nap every afternoon. And when Dad was 70, he died out in LA. In my previous video, I talked about that. And Mother became a widow. She was 69. It was decided the house would be sold. She should move into an apartment. Lionel thought I should go out and help. I had just come back from visiting Dad before his final surgery. I said, no, Lionel, you have to go out. You have to help. And the Good Samaritan, Lily Dennis, her sister-in-law, found an apartment for Mother in her apartment building, and Mother moved in to this apartment building. This began Mother's pattern. She was constantly on the move. She was moving from one dwelling to another dwelling. A dwelling would become unsatisfactory for some reason. Another place appeared better for her. I can remember she was in a dilemma in an apartment in Canoga Park where Charles and Anna lived. She had sort of moved in with them and vasculated between her apartment and Charles's home. Charles and Anna had a young family of their own. The situation, I imagine, was just terrible. And I decided to go out there, and it was time for her to move into a retirement home. I found a retirement home. I packed her up. I sold what furniture she had, and Anna helped load the car with her possessions, and I said I would stay until everything was in place in her new dwelling. This dwelling was a great big bedroom with a lot of cupboards, her own bathroom. She didn't like it. She didn't like it. She didn't hold it against me that I'd moved her. She said Saralee was influenced by the chandelier in the dining room, and that's why she decided I should move. I decided she should move because she would get 3 meals a day, a place to sleep, and some services, which she couldn't continue with her own. Another time I remember going out, this time she was in a different apartment, sparsely furnished. She felt when she went to a doctor, the more she complained, the more pills she'd get, the better she'd feel. I slept on a sleeping bag that Charles brought in. I tried to assist. I went with her to the doctor. The doctor looked at me, shook his finger in my face, and said, "Do you have a family?" And I said, "Yes, I have a husband. I have 5 children." He said, "Get on the first plane and go home." I did. During this period, it was up and down with Mother. She was either feeling marvelous and could do everything, or she was down in the dumps and she couldn't do anything. She was manic depressive. At that period, it didn't seem to be a well-known disease. And she was never at a level point. During this period, too, she decided St. Paul was a place for her to live. And she would then move to St. Paul, and Lionel and Myra would help her as best she could. She'd come and visit me for large times. When she was with me, sometimes she would go to our lake cabin, sometimes she wouldn't. One time when she was with us, she was reading the newspaper and she found a facility. The woman had an apartment building and she would serve 3 meals a day. Mother and I went to interview this lady. The lady thought Mother was a sweet lady. Mother liked the lady. And she moved from St. Paul into this apartment. It was on the east side of Bismarck. It was a very, very nice apartment, a kitchen, a dining area, a living room, a bedroom, nicely furnished. I don't know what the meals were like that she served. Mother was high. Mother volunteered at a thrift shop that was run by the handicapped citizen. She was cashier. She created little plants that she would bring, and they would be sold there. She worked at the thrift shop as a cashier. She volunteered at the St. Alexis Hospital. She took charge of the waiting room for relatives and family of patients who were having surgery, and was in touch with the operating room and the recovery room, and she would impart this knowledge to the people waiting. One of our friends who had this experience said Mother was very good at this job. She was very active. She was near the big mall. She went shopping a lot. She bought a lot of things that were on sale, whether it was necessary or not. I don't know how long she remained in this apartment, but as with other apartments, she became disenchanted. She was with us during this period, Shabbat dinners, and when we had outings, she would come with us on outings. And she decided she would go back to St. Paul, and she would then find a good living place. And Lionel and Myra would again be supervising I'm trying to think. She was with me once after I enrolled in Mary College to complete my education. She said she was very happy I was going back. She always felt guilty that I had left university because of her illness, and now I was going to earn my degree. At this time, she was very, very cooperative. Sometimes she would get downtown by herself and then let me know, pick her up, bring her to my home. And I was, with my free time, I was studying before she left for St. Paul. I don't recall if she visited it again, but that was her pattern. Up and down, finding living spaces, making them livable, finding fault, finding new livable places. Her pattern to me was, it was a 5-star hotel. I think I'll just relate one other incident. She would get up early, she would sit in the living room and read the newspaper. It was summer, I would get up about 7:30. I would trudge into the kitchen through the living room, see her reading, and I said, Mother, it would be nice when you're up early if you could set the breakfast table. That would be a chore I wouldn't have to do. And she said, well, Saralee, if I did that, I would make noise and I would just disturb you. And I said, don't look at it that way. I said, it would be really a pleasure for me. And I said, when you started setting the table, you could shut the door to the kitchen. I wouldn't hear a thing. I'm a sound sleeper. And Mother said, no, Saralee, I know if I set the table, it would be disturbing and I would wake you up. Well, that was the end of that conversation. But that I'm telling you that just to show you her pattern. Okay. I'm moving on now. Mother lived to the age of 88. During this period, I can't recall how well she was, but she was in the hospital, and she had been resuscitated twice. Daniel was a young doctor at that time. He was in the Twin Cities when Sid and I were visiting, and he said, this is a mistake. When an older person is resuscitated, they never regain the spot they were before. And if Mother needs resuscitation, there should be an order left with the doctor and nurse. She shouldn't be resuscitated. And we left this order. Mother was in the hospital. Sid and I knew this would be our last visit. She was sitting up. She seemed very, very alert. She'd had cataract surgery, and at that time you had to wear eyeglasses that exaggerated your eyes. They weren't becoming glasses at all. Mother was a beautiful daughter, young woman. She was a beautiful woman in Grafton. She always dressed as best she could. She always looked presentable. We both knew that this would be our last visit, and Mother said, I wasn't so bad, was I? And I said, no, Mother, you weren't. I said, you look just beautiful. I'll remember you as this beautiful woman. Seems to me there just was no more conversation. She shed a few tears. I shed a few tears. Sid was standing by. We had requested a nurse to come into the room beforehand. Sid didn't say anything. And after this short interaction, Sid and I left. Mother died shortly after this. The plot had been determined to be in our Jewish cemetery in Bismarck. The casket was opened was an open casket in the funeral home in Bismarck. The funeral was very sparsely attended. By that time, there were very few Jews living in Bismarck, and she didn't know anybody other than the family at this point. I don't remember any bereavement dinner, and I'm thinking back. I'm sure I didn't cover many of the important events in her life, but I think I've given you a clear picture of a very, very capable woman whose circumstances deteriorated. As I think back, when she was well, she attempted and did make the best of the opportunities presented. And as a closing thought, I think she did the best with what she had. And now I'm ending this epic. Thank you, Arit, for this opportunity to share my memories of my mother. And shalom.